Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Corey Pierce, Marketing Director at ChurnZero, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled Customer Success in Finance, Get Aligned. On this webcast, we will be discussing the process of getting a customer to retention and its financial impact. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we are recording this session. A link to the recording will be available approximately 24 hours after the webinar. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome to submit your questions via the question and answer box, and our staff will try and answer them as we go. We will also be conducting a few audience polls during the webcast, and we encourage you to participate when prompted. And lastly, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of this webinar where we will address as many of your questions as we can. Now, I'm pleased to introduce to you our presenters for today. From the finance perspective, we have Chris Weber, who is the product manager at SaaSoptics, which is a cloud-based financial solution for subscription businesses. Chris is a passionate champion of all things SaaS and has a strong financial background. Prior to SaaSoptics, he worked as the manager of financial operations at Science Logic. He also has a triple major in finance, accounting, and business management. Our other presenter today, who will be talking from the CS perspective, is Mon Tsang, who is the founder and CEO of ChurnZero, which is a real-time customer success platform that helps subscription businesses fight churn. Mon is a serial entrepreneur and really understands the power that retention can have on a business. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Mon.
All right, well, thanks, Corey. I will share my screen. Now, before I get started, let's go ahead and actually do a couple of polls, if that's okay. And I'm sharing. So why don't we launch the poll? And the information on the poll is quite simply, how often do you collaborate with the other side? And of course, we don't want to make this too much of a, them versus us, but the other side would be, if you're on the CS, how often are you collaborating with finance? And if you're on the finance side, how often are you collaborating with CS? So go ahead and actually mark that. Is it once a week or more? That would be great. Do you do monthly? Maybe do a monthly overview, review, reporting, or maybe quarterly for board meetings. And if you don't really see each other, maybe annually. And don't necessarily do this for yourself. Do it for your group, right? How often does your group and the other group work together? So let's just wait a few more seconds for the polls, and then once we're done, we'll show you the results. All right, I think we have 75% of the folks who voted, so let's go ahead and actually close out this poll and share the results. And can you share the results on the screen? Is that what folks are seeing? Okay. Well, it looks like, wow, that's actually great. So it seems like the majority of folks on this call collaborate weekly with finance. And, it'll be interesting to see what you focus on. Perhaps it's about, accounts, specific accounts, or maybe it's just you say hi and have lunch, but it doesn't matter. So that's great. So the good news is that you guys are collaborating. Some of you, the 7% of you that are never, let's try to fix that here today. All right, well, that's good. That's interesting to know. I do have one more poll, okay? And this poll is when it comes to retention reporting, and let me describe this a little bit. I mean, I'm sure both finance and customer success, you both have reporting on, are you retaining your customers? And I don't really care how you actually calculate it. It's just how do you retain your customers. I'm talking about who owns it and reports it to the rest of the organization. So who owns it and delivers to the rest of the organization? Is it finance, customer success, both? Or other meaning it's not either of you, it's some other department. So let's take a minute to respond to this poll, right? So once again, when it comes to reporting retention, so that would be, percentage renewal, revenue renewal, logo renewal, doesn't matter. Who reports that to the rest of the company, whether it's the CX team or the CXO team, or to the board. So let's go ahead and collect that. Let's give you a few more seconds to vote. I've gotten 60% of you to vote. If we can get that to 75%, that would be very interesting. So once again, who owns revenue retention reporting in your company? All right, well, why don't we close it out, Corey, and show the results. It's interesting. Okay. So a third, and the plurality are folks who have joint ownership of retention reporting. And it looks like it's actually quite even, right? So it looks like it's a third of you, a third of you, a third of you, and then I'm just going to, there's still a lot of other. I wonder what the other would be. Maybe sales? Probably, right? So probably sales. All right, well, that's really interesting. So this will be good to know. This will be good for you guys to talk about customer success. All right, so I'm here to talk about customer success. And I'm sorry?
And share your screen.
Oh, I'm sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen? Okay. How's that? Okay, great. So I'm here to talk about customer success. And, part of the description of our webinar is, CS is from Venus and finance is from Mars. As Corey said, I'm a serial entrepreneur, so I've had both finance and CS report to me. And, I think they do think fairly differently. You guys have one thing in common, though, and it's very powerful. You both understand the power of retention, and I think that's really important. A strong retention means, that the valuation of the company goes up, that profitability goes up, that growth goes up. And when I talk to people around different departments within the organization, it is the finance department and it is the CS department that really understands this. So this is very, very useful. My goal today is to give the finance folks on this call a glimpse of how customer success works. Now, I'm going to focus very hard on the top few items that CS teams really focus on, so I'm not really going to drill down to all the details, but I want to focus on those main things. Usually when you think about customer success, finance probably thinks about the renewal rate. Hey, are you getting the renewal? But of course, there's way more to that than just the renewal rate. The renewal rate is really what's above the waterline. If you look at an iceberg, there's so much that goes on below the waterline, right? And so I want to share to the finance folks what customer success is all about. And I'll focus on a few things. One, actually, I know there are companies of all different sizes on this call. And customer success really has a very typical evolution from really small companies to larger companies. And, at a very small company, it's all hands on deck. Everyone's focused. Everyone's job is success. And while that works in the beginning, right, because you're all, trying to make things work and try to figure out if you actually have a good product that customers want to buy, it certainly does not scale, right? It's like the soccer team with every kid going after the ball being retention. What I see after that, after this all hands on deck type of motion, is then you actually put processes around exceptions, right? So, what happens if a customer goes dark? What if a customer tells you that they're not renewing? Then you have a strike team or whatnot. So you actually have processes handling exceptions. Now, really, the evolution is that you actually have journeys all mapped out for your clients, and when you do that, you become a professional CS team. So I'm going to really focus more on that today, on what happens when you do have a well-oiled CS team that's doing interesting work. All right, so from the point of view of CS, one of the things that a CS team really thinks about is journeys, milestones, and achievements, right? So I'm going to drill down into that. The idea is that a customer goes through a journey, and a good journey is one that leads your customer to success. Success can be defined in many, many different ways, but the idea is that you really want your customer who's using your product and service to get good use out of it and are successful in using it to do whatever their goals are. Sometimes it may be to reduce costs, maybe it's increased productivity, maybe it's increased sales. Any number of things. Success is really depends on what product or service that you own. Now, there are several journeys that you think about when you're in customer success. Some sort of the most obvious examples is an onboarding journey, right? So this is when a customer joins you. You want to make sure they're onboarded well. You may also put them on a renewal journey, so T-minus 6 months, T-minus 3 months if you're an annual subscription or a multi-year subscription. You put them into a journey where you're really trying to get the renewal from them. And maybe another example of a journey is an advocacy journey where you know that they're happy and you want to actually slowly move them from being only a happy customer that's telling you nice things to an advocate that's actually sharing all the great things to the rest of the organization. Now, I want to drill down. I'm not going to drill down all of these, but the idea for the finance people in the group is that the CS team really thinks about taking their customers through these types of journeys through the customer life cycle. So let me focus on one. Probably the one that we actually think is the most important is onboarding, right? So once a customer decides to use your product and service, let's go ahead and onboard them correctly. One of the things we know, most of the folks here are subscription businesses, and I think we all know that if you don't get off to a good start, you can really fall into a bad place and your renewal's at jeopardy right away. So let me drill down into an onboarding. So that's why onboarding is so important. So let me drill down into perhaps a typical onboarding journey that has 3 milestones. So the 3 milestones in front of you would be, hey, let's do a kickoff call. Then after that, we'll do training, and then after that, we'll do our first quarterly call. Right. So the idea is that can you map this out? Give timelines to this, have achievements and tasks associated with it, and then if you drill down to a milestone, you will have achievements and tasks that you need to do in order to have this journey be effective, right? So a great CS team, that's sort of been evolved, gone through a couple of renewal cycles, will start to understand what a good journey will look like for, their different journeys in the customer lifecycle, in this case, onboarding. So you can see here on the right-hand side, perhaps there's a few achievements around, making sure that worksheets are completed, that the configuration is completed, that there are initial logins to this product, and then of course there's tasks that the CS team may want to work on. Now, some of you will have high velocity businesses where you don't touch the client as much, so maybe there are fewer tasks and more achievements, maybe there's more automation. It doesn't matter, everyone's journey is a little bit different. This is just one example. To continue to focus on onboarding, the onboarding journey, one of the things that certainly the CS team will worry about is what are the top issues that they face. These are some of the ones that we hear about a lot. The first one would be mismatched expectations. And, this is sometimes called blame sales. Salespeople will perhaps get the prospect all hyped up on what your product and service does, and it's a mismatched expectation, and it gets off on a wrong foot right away. And this happens, more often than we want it to happen. So, this is probably one of the things that a CS team really deals with a lot. Other onboarding issues, the wrong people are on the team, you don't have the right experts. And then, of course, there are implementation hiccups, people don't do what they say they're going to do, and then other things that happen. So, so the idea is to, understand, what goes on in the journey, look at the top issues, but then also manage your customers through the journey. And so the idea of actually having a journey is then you can track if somebody's on track, somebody's behind, or somebody's stuck, right? So you can either do this manually. There's technologies like ours, from ChurnZero, that can help you with this. But the idea is that once you've mapped the journey, the whole point is, are people on track? And if they're behind, why are they behind? And what you want to really focus on is to see, one, how well you are doing. Two, to see if your journey has problems, right? Maybe there's a place that people always get stuck. Maybe it takes a little, maybe the timelines are unrealistic. And the most important thing is that, CS teams have to be very flexible and always be modifying the journey, updating the journey. Now, let me move on from journeys, right? So what else do CS people focus on? One of the most important things is after you get going and getting people on track is to make sure you get engagement. And so you want to get your customers engaged, and I break it down to 3 things. Are they using your product or service? That's, of course, most important, especially for the subscription businesses. If they don't use your product or service, they're simply not going to renew. You also want to have business communications with them. And so this is maybe for the higher touch folks in the audience where, are you saying, hey, are you getting what you want out of this product? Are you seeing success? How can we help you meet your business goals? And then there's support communications, right? So, we all have support teams that help out with smaller issues. Are they communicating with support? Now, if you do have the technology, one of the things you can do is actually look for trends and consistency in usage. So this would be a fictional company, that has features that you want people to use. You can see, how well you're doing. Are people using it the way you expect to? And looking for trends and consistency is really what a CS team will look for. Now, the other thing that CS teams look for is feedback, of course, right? So the surveys is very important. And so if you haven't heard of an NPS survey in the finance team, that's called Net Promoter Score. And I'm sure you've taken a few of these or been asked. And it looks like this: how likely is it that you would recommend this product to a friend or colleague? And so this is actually a very quick, 5-second survey that gets collected from your customers that really will give you a indication of how well they like you. And then of course, you can do your own manual calls and feedbacks to get to get feedback from your customer. Now, what you want to do then is, I know on the finance team, people want scores and all that, and there's definitely a trend to produce health scores on customers. So, we recommend that this is a focus for CS teams. So, finance folks, if you work with a CS team that doesn't have health scores, I would encourage you to encourage them to do so. And you can put a lot of things into a health score. You can put qualitative factors. Now, historically, it's always been all qualitative, and that is a human being says, well, they love us, or they're very responsive, they're very engaged with our process. They're telling us they're getting ROI. They're a great fit customer because, they're in the right vertical. These are real important factors, and they definitely should be put into a health score. Now, what you also want to put in, and this is, I think lacking for a lot of folks, but, technology helps here, is to put in quantitative factors. And so are they using your product, right? Are they using the right features? And is it trending correctly over time? Is it, increasing engagement or decreasing engagement? Are they utilizing your services? They bought 10 licenses, are they using 10? And then support ticket history, are they communicating with support? And if they're communicating, that's great. If they're communicating a lot with a lot of bad problems, well, then of course that's not as good. And then of course, NPS scores and feedback surveys, those are very important as well. Now you put this into a score, and it's just, generally it could be anything from just the color. We use a 0 to 100 scoring system. Some people use 1 to 5. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you do it. It's all really the same. It's really you want to be able to quickly score your customers. Now, and also you're not going to have all these factors at your fingertips. So my advice is start somewhere. Like, get what you can, and if it's not exhaustive, that's okay. Having something is better than nothing. And when you do have a score, and we happen to call our health score a ChurnScore, it does a lot of great things. It really unlocks a lot of value. So one thing you can do is to prioritize renewals. So you may say, look, I have 10 renewal candidates in the next 30 days. Let me see how their health is. And of course, I'm going to focus on the green ones first. I'm going to get these low-hanging fruit. Then I'm going to focus on the yellow ones that maybe are not as healthy. And then maybe I'll at the end, I'll do a couple of Hail Marys to try to get a red one back in. And so the idea is that, this is certainly one use of renewals, of health scores, is to prioritize renewals. By the way, it will also help you with forecasting as well, right? And so, another way to use the score is to take a look at your health across your entire base. So, what percentage of your base is green and healthy? What percentage is yellow? And so, it just gives a very nice single score to really understand your customer base. Now, a CS team digs down much deeper than this, but sometimes it's just really great to have a single number health score that that will help you prioritize things. And I know for those of you who are on the finance side, you love numbers, so I would encourage you once again that if your CS team is not doing a health score, maybe help them do it. And if you have to, start with Excel. And if you would want to invest in technology, certainly there are those out there like ours. Now, the other thing that CS teams focus on a lot is to manage exceptions, right? So, you have journeys, you have scores. Ideally people stay on their path in the journey, but very few people actually do. So then you have to have plays, right? So, you have a playbook full of plays that you basically unleash on those who are not meeting expectations, that they're falling off in one way or another. And so this is really a big part of what CS teams do. In fact, it's probably a little too much, but it is the reality. And that is managing exceptions. So a couple of examples would be, there's an unexpected change in how they engage in your service. So they use it less or use it more. You get an unexpected survey result. Man, I thought they loved us, but they would not recommend us to others. There's a sudden change in the health score. So based on some of the inputs, things have happened. So these are some of the things that, and you can read the rest on your own, but these are some of the things that CS people really do almost on a daily basis when they get hit in the back of their head with someone who's gone off the path, off the journey, and they will have to sort of pull out a play in order to manage them. Now, cohort analysis. Now, we actually don't see a lot of CS teams working on this, but we definitely encourage it if you can. And I know finance team, you do a lot of cohort analysis, but the idea, and I've shaded out some data here, but the idea is, this particular one is how engages your client with your service over time, right, by cohort. And, for those CS people who are not using cohort analysis, you generally want it to be greener as you go down, okay? So every new set of customers that start month over month, say, you just want it to be better, right? Get them engaged earlier and earlier. And that's sort of where the technology can really help you, is to understand, how well you're doing cohort by cohort and always be improving. So let me end here. But by the time the renewal happens for the CS team, it's a lagging indicator. Most of the folks that that I meet on the CS side, renewals are important to them, but by the time that happens, they already knew it. Maybe sometimes there's a surprise. There shouldn't be much of a surprise, but it's all those other things that they're doing with journeys, with managing exceptions, with scoring the customers that got them here. And by the time this happens, they should know exactly what's supposed to happen. Now, before I pass it over to Chris, let me do one more poll here. And so the poll is, why don't you share with us what metrics your company tracks? So, in your company, which one of these do you track? It could be one, it could be many. So do you have customer health scores? Do you use NPS, Net Promoter Score? Do you calculate logo churn or customer churn, right? So this would be the number of customers that you're churning. Or do you do revenue churn, where you basically count up the dollars and then you do revenue churn? And also, do you do customer lifetime value? I haven't mentioned that yet here. Chris will talk about this in a bit, but if you've heard of it and you track it, please share it here. So it could be multiple choices. So select all the ones that your company tracks. So let me see, we got 62% voted, so let's just keep it open for another 10 seconds. This will be interesting, see, what are the most popular metrics at a subscription business company. All right, well, let's just close it off for now, and so for the sake of time, and let's go ahead and share the results. Okay, so revenue churn is actually a leader by far, right? That's a really good lead. So 71% of the folks on this call report their company will report revenue churn. And then I would say customer lifetime value is the least tracked. Customer health score, only 39% of you do that. And then NPS, half, which is good. And then logo churn, a little less than half. Okay, that's interesting. So So I think that might give a little bit for Chris to work with, especially on customer lifetime value. So thanks a lot, and let me pass it over to Chris, who will talk to you about finance.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mon. Let me see. All right, thanks for bearing with me while I got the screen share switched over. It's really actually interesting that none of those metrics were over 75%. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about the finance perspective, give some context to why finance is generally really interested in churn. And I think it's a phenomenal point that Johan's making, that renewals are a lagging indicator. And typically in a finance department, they're focused on data. GAAP metrics are really already recorded. It's kind of looking in the rearview mirror in hopes of gaining insight into what the future is going to hold. But with a modern SaaS company, you're seeing a little bit of a shift in the general responsibilities of a finance team. So being a former finance professional and still heavily involved in it here at SaaSoptics, it's really moving beyond bean counting. And I use that term in a kind sense of the meaning, but you're seeing a lot more focus on strategic initiatives. So strategic CFOs, people in finance departments that aren't necessarily coming with a CPA background or public accounting background, with a focus on future performance, right? As you know, in a SaaS company, it's all about growth. So you're trying to model out hiring plans, funding strategies, and specifically identifying trends. So you will see finance teams doing a decent amount of cohort analysis, or absolutely hoping that they're doing cohort analysis, because that's really where you're going to uncover what might be driving the trends you're seeing. But as I mentioned, it's about growth, but it's also efficient growth. And the customer success team is a critical component of that. That's why the genesis for this webinar, making sure that both departments are in sync and we understand what the other side is doing, but also what's of importance to them. So from a finance perspective, the customer base, you want to monetize that customer base. You want to ensure that you're continuing to acquire and grow new customers, but specifically around retention as well. So I'm going to go through some of the SaaS metrics. By no means is this a comprehensive list. If you would like to, we published something called the SaaSpedia that provides a lot more metrics that you could be looking at, but I do want to cover some of the big ones. We're going to be talking a lot about annual recurring revenue or monthly recurring revenue, and the basis for how you're going to benchmark your business is really a good way of looking at it is what's the average contract you're signing. If you're signing month-to-month contracts, you want to look at things from a monthly perspective, so you're going to focus on churn on a monthly basis and monthly recurring revenue. If you're typically selling annual agreements, you're likely benchmarked on annual recurring revenue, or sometimes referred to as annual contract value. Kind of in line with the theme of efficient growth, we're not going to dive too much into these metrics, but it's certainly something your finance team is heavily looking at and involves a component of GAAP financials, and that's customer acquisition cost, loosely kind of defined as your total sales and marketing spend divided by the number of customers that you acquired in the period. Now, again, because these aren't GAAP metrics, the important thing is to make sure that you're consistent in how you're recording them, and that you kind of annotate anytime you're publishing these metrics to define how you're reporting it, because sometimes you'll see companies report the prior period's total sales and marketing spend. A good example is, hey, the investment I'm making in Q2 really leads to new customers in Q3. So there's a little variance in how customer acquisition costs can be recorded, but most importantly, it's the time to recover that, right? If you're spending 10x, it's going to take you, 10 months to recover that initial investment. That's really important from a finance perspective to know, because it helps in line with that earlier slide of talking about, when do we need to go to the market for potentially another round of funding, or are we going to have enough cash to continue reinvesting in the business? What we are going to spend a decent amount of time talking about today is churn, customer retention from a finance perspective, and the impact that has on the customer lifetime value. And I'll define customer lifetime value in more detail here in a minute. Specifically, kind of taking both pieces, combining them together, you're looking at customer lifetime value to customer acquisition cost and that ratio. It's a good indication of how healthy your business is. Is this something that's sustainable? And do you really want to kind of put the pedal to the floor and really invest in your business to acquire more customers? When a lot of people think of financial metrics, or especially if you guys are doing like monthly stand-ups, like company-wide announcements, maybe you guys have a live dashboard in the office that's displaying some of these metrics. A lot of times you're seeing kind of the trend of that ARR or MRR, depending on how you're recording it, and customer count over time. So this is kind of a good overview, a good basis to have, but what's really important is to drill in, and you're gonna see a theme here of continuing to drill in and identifying underlying trends in the data, because you really want to focus on that efficient growth. So the ability to drill in and see who you're losing from a finance perspective and what's growing the business. Now from a CS perspective, right, the things that you can control, certainly your lost customers, the ability to expand, so grow that account as far as their usage of the product, and contraction as well. Mon talked a lot about journeys, and those journeys as they evolve from a customer success perspective. And from a finance point of view, we're also looking at it as a financial journey, right? We understand that as the customer first starts with you, there's going to be retention or churn issues. There might be contraction, so they renewed, but they're slowly decreasing the usage of the product, and that can be both feature usage or revenue usage. Now, finance has great line of sight into the revenue usage, but that data about feature usage and all those, that tidbit of information, the qualitative and quantitative data that Mon was talking about, you guys really have access to. So that's why cohesion between the two teams is so important, because it also identifies potentially ways to expand that user base. So what is customer lifetime value? Simply put, it's the typical customer in your business and the value that or consideration that they're providing to your business over the course of the relationship. This is really, really important to get a handle on. You know, in the survey, it was the lowest metric that's reported on. It's certainly one that maybe your finance team is reporting. It's just not widely reported. But essentially, the questions that the finance team is trying to ask the CS team is to get a good gauge of the customer lifetime value. So every customer that I add to the business, what is the ultimate value over the course of that lifetime? So a little bit more detailed estimation. So for the finance people on here, you also want to typically incorporate a gross margin contribution. So if you have immediately upon closing or executing that contract, you have royalties you have to pay, or you have a cost of goods sold associated with it, certainly want to take that out of the equation. If you want more of a hardcore like finance definition, certainly look at our SaaSpedia. I'm just trying to give it a general overview here. So it's average revenue per account. Again, I'm not defining that as MRR or ARR. It really depends on how your contracts are defined and how you're tracking it. You want the churn rate to be the same. So if you're looking at MRR, your churn rate needs to be a monthly churn rate, and then incorporate the gross margin. But I'm going to try to do some visualizations just because it's not necessarily the number. I think that's one mistake that we probably make, is focus on a percent, like a churn percent from a logo perspective or dollar percent. But it's not just that number, it's the impact of that number and how it affects all of the other metrics and potentially even business decisions that your executive team is making as far as steering the company in one direction or another. You know, do we continue to hit the accelerator and grow the company, or do we need to scale back a little bit and figure some things out? So let's take a simple example and throw some visualizations to it. I love the bucket analogy. You know, it makes so much sense as far as if you have churn, you have a leaky bucket. How much churn indicates how much water you're losing. If you have tons of churn, you're never going to be able to fill that bucket fast enough, and it actually can put a ceiling on your growth potential. So with 2% monthly churn, you know, you're looking at an average customer lifetime. Again, this is average across the entire cohort or group of customers, 50 months. So lifetime or average lifetime is an inverse of your churn. That's why there's so much focus on churn, but it also can help in the calculation of that total lifetime value. So if we look at what this cohort looks like, and here's just a quick example or visualization, a cohort of 10,000 with 2% monthly churn. What you're looking at there is kind of an exponential decay with that kind of the line indicating your year-over-year growth or actually churn rate in that regards. Now, there's something else in regards to churn. Most people think of churn as a negative, as people leaving your business and that or utilization, but that's true from a customer count or a logo count perspective. But from a dollar perspective, you can actually run into something where it's negative churn. This is a phenomenal situation to be in. It's something that every company kind of aspires to achieve. It can be very difficult to achieve. If you're in this position, it's a great position to be in because what you're looking at is instead of exponential decay, you're looking at exponential growth. And this is where your customer base year after year continues to consume more of your product if that equates to more revenue to your business, or they just happen to consume the same level and you're uplifting the renewals. You could get into a situation where that growth more than covers any customers that are churning out of that cohort. Now notice I'm not doing a average customer lifetime calculation because that lifetime is really, you can't reinvent. Your customer base doesn't multiply and doesn't grow from the initial customer base. From a dollar perspective, though, it can. You can grow that cohort of 10,000 if it's dollar based, 10,000 MRR or ARR. You can grow that. So I have a red asterisk here because there is a better formula for calculating customer lifetime value and actually the lifetime that incorporates things like a discount rate or your growth rate of those customers that are not churning. So there's certainly a better calculation to do if you're in the negative churn situation. But I just want to kind of iterate why churn is so important and what we're tracking from a finance perspective. So when you layer all these on top of each other, let's say you're not in that negative churn scenario, you actually are experiencing churn. Each kind of section of this graph on the right is a cohort. So you want to look and see how the cohorts are performing. This is probably a theoretical example in that there's consistent churn across all your cohorts. So your cohorts aren't performing better or worse than another. But it illustrates the fact that essentially your growth rate starts to decrease if you're not able to solve your churn issue, if it stays consistent. So early on in your business, if you have 100 customers, 2% churn, not a big deal to find 2 new customers to replace, not really a big impact to your churn rate. If you have 1 million customers, a 2% churn rate, it can be a challenge to find enough new customers to replace that. So it's really important to be tracking this, making sure that you're gradually improving because it does affect most of the other SaaS metrics. Now the inverse, just like we did in the simple example, if you're in negative churn, kind of your growth, year-over-year growth rate is endless. Hopefully your churn rate over time is improving. And one of the things that we get asked a lot is what are some good benchmarks? We can certainly give you some guidelines, but what's important there too is also understand what could be driving churn. And from a finance perspective, the customer success team has better access to that. I was talking about the blame sales game, or another thing that we see is, and I talked earlier about that customer acquisition cost. Somebody might say, hey, I have a really low customer acquisition cost. I'm better off than somebody who has a higher customer acquisition cost. But if you look at the underlying principles that are driving that, they might have a freemium model or a trial, right? So somebody's coming to them, very low cost of entry, not having to have AEs or account executives, sales team, getting that person engaged. They have nothing table stakes on the table. So you might see the churn, the first couple periods be a lot higher than somebody else who has a higher cost of sales and is really investing a lot to acquire that customer. So every business is a little bit different, but these are all certainly metrics you want to be tracking. To that point, though, you're eventually going to reach an inflection point with subscription businesses. And this is why it's so important to stay on top of this. And this is really why a finance team is engaged in both GAAP metrics and SaaS metrics, and they really need to focus on this because at some point you will reach an inflection point where renewals become more important almost than the net new business. SaaS in general, you're typically going to have, it's almost like a winner take all. You're going to have those market leaders. A good example of that, let's look at CRMs. For example, Salesforce has certainly reached that inflection point where if people are evaluating a CRM, likely Salesforce is in that mix. They've achieved that because they've spent so much money in marketing. But if they experience a 5, 10, 15% churn rate, they're just going to get hammered in the market because there's not enough new customers to replace them. Why is that relevant now? Is it's really important to be gauging when that inflection point happens. Make sure that you have those processes in place and get ahead of it. That's why I think ChurnZero is so important and critical from a finance perspective, and something that I would champion is you want to make sure you have these processes in place before you reach that inflection point. And kind of why is that so important? Because if you don't solve this churn issue, you're essentially going to have a ceiling or cap on how much you can grow. Right? Everybody likes to, when they're pitching their business and they're raising their first rounds of funding, they frequently get asked, well, what's the market potential? But also, once you're established, and everybody on this webinar is working with an established company, you also have to look at what the cap is. And churn directly relates to that cap, because if you don't fix that churn issue, you're never going to be able to actually achieve above a certain growth rate. You see here over to the right, if I had extended this, another 40 quarters out, that churn rate, if it stays consistent, will essentially provide a ceiling as far as your year-over-year growth, and it'll be essentially, you won't be growing at all. So very important to be aware of and stay ahead of. Cohort performance, we've kind of been talking about how it's so important to identify those trends, and why that's important is because you're trying to see, are things getting better or getting worse? Because the renewal is a lagging indicator, one of the metrics that you do have access to from a finance perspective is, well, it's a lagging indicator, but at least is it better this year than last year? You can do things with cohort analysis that you can look at and drill into. Setting expectations during the hiring process. So one of the things I like to point to as a good example is potentially the best sales rep might not be the best sales rep. They might be selling deals that you have to manage the expectations for. So I'm going to pick on myself here. Here's just a hypothetical example, but the MRR ARR that I added in February in this demo, 82% is churning out, so maybe doing something in the sales cycle, setting incorrect expectations, etc. But the ability to join both sets of data, both finance and success, allows you to affect change. So not only is churn actually have the ability to steer the ship in a different direction. That's why the importance of the strategic orientation of a finance team, the strategic CFO or FP&A personnel, et cetera, because you have the ability, customer success and finance together can help change things. They can identify those trends, see what's working, see what's not working, so that you can affect change to achieve efficient growth by potentially for the monetization, a more rapid onboarding process, feature adoption. From an acquisition or new customer perspective, you can, finance team, customer success team together can help shape what the ideal customer profile looks like, and not in just the true sense of, hey, what does the ideal customer look like to acquire, but how do we acquire customers that will be successful next year and the year after, et cetera, to help drive that growth rate. The other thing, and this, I'm going to interject a little bit from the product perspective here too, even though my background's in finance, is product enhancements. The finance team and customer success team can also identify things in the product that you are selling that potentially you could take to your product team and say, hey, we know that the most successful companies from a renewal rate perspective, from a finance perspective, use these products. And the least successful use these products. Nobody likes to talk about removing features or sunsetting product lines, but if you're noticing that they're having higher churn, et cetera, it might make more sense. All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over back to Corey, open up to Q&A. And we thank you so much for joining today, hopefully giving you a little bit of perspective on both the finance team's perspective and the customer success team's perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris and you, Mon, for the presentations. At this time, I'd like to invite the audience to please go ahead and submit your questions via the question and answer box in your webinar console. And we will take this time to address any questions that you might have had during the presentation. Let's see. We have a first question, and that is, what advice or resources would you recommend for a business transitioning from a perpetual product to a SaaS model?
So there's definitely two ways to think about it, right? From a perpetual model to a SaaS model. The finance implications are huge. Chris, do you have much experience with that? I certainly have a few customers that have gone through that. Is that?
Yeah, actually, I have a fair amount of experience. Got to live through that transformation myself. It's really important to understand. Hopefully, if you're model today, you might have a maintenance component of your business. So I'm not sure, what side you might be on, whether it's finance or customer success. If you have a maintenance component and you're in a perpetual model currently, you might want to start building these metrics around that maintenance component because you can really kind of generate the same metrics leveraging the maintenance component. If not, you're just going to have to slowly transition. I don't know, it's really more of an executive team decision. Are you going to continue to sell perpetual? You got to do some math there and say, well, because your customers certainly are going to, if you're offering both to the marketplace, you got to make sure that your subscription product is priced adequately so that they adopt to it. The big thing that you probably want to focus on is that recurring revenue stream. I guess from a customer success example, you're really going to have to build a lot of processes around it because it is no longer a one-time sale. The good news is you don't have to reinvent yourself every month. You're going to continue to have revenue coming in from that customers that you sold prior, but you also need to make sure that your product is at a point that it'll continue to support them, that they'll be passionate champions of your product so that they continue to grow.
Hey, let me add a few things. It is the move, by the way, from perpetual products and licenses to the SaaS model that has created customer success to begin with. And so, it used to be that you would sell a perpetual license and they paid you all up front and they maybe pay you another 10 to 15% every year. But since they gave it to you all up front, there was a less of an incentive for a company to service them well. Right? Like, all right, if you don't use it, it's not a huge deal. It's completely different now. And so if you are moving from a perpetual product to a SaaS model, really dig into the customer success component of it because they will be able to cancel the subscription on every month or every year or every 2 years, however you do your subscriptions. And that's the reason why customer success exists to begin with. In terms of resources, I would go ahead. There's a couple of folks out there who do really well on understanding SaaS. Just do a search for SaaS metrics. And you'll get things from SaaSter, you'll get things from forentrepreneurs.com, and they will really go over the metrics very deeply for you.
Great. We have our next question, and it is on the CS side of things. And the question is, what are some best practices about asking for NPS? In other words, how often and in what context?
Yeah, I can answer that. So, generally NPS, Net Promoter Scores, That survey, traditionally, was done like most surveys, kind of blasted out on one day every X months. And that's really a horrible way of doing it. Partially because maybe you send it out on a Monday where everyone's a little bit crankier, or maybe you sent it out, after, a day where you had bugs in your product. So you're just putting too much in one basket. What we tell our clients to do is you should really focus in on the customer. And once they've been onboarded and have been using your product for, call it a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is that you think they actually they will have a good opinion, then you can automatically fire off an NPS. Now that's the tricky part, right? Is, can you get help in saying, well, when a customer crosses this threshold, go ahead and fire off an NPS. But that's really how you want to do it. And then, in terms of best practices, we have customers doing it as often as every 3 months. I think that's a little bit, I think that's a lot. But 6 months certainly I think is not too much of a problem, and certainly at least every year. And since it's such a short survey, it's not asking a lot of your clients. So so my recommendation is every 6 months, and then have the first one fire when your customer actually has a sense of what your product is supposed to be doing for them.
Great. We actually have a follow-up question from the same attendee on NPS. So following up on the NPS question, do you recommend surveying in-app or via email?
Yeah, so those of you who have a web application, I think the answer is both. So a good NPS survey technology, we have one, will make sure that they only collect one of the scores. I think if you do both, you will actually, what we've seen is that your response rate will go up 15 to 20%. So as a response rate, depending on how you survey and how big your group is and how engaged they are, we've seen response rates, on the low end at 15%, on the high end as much as 60% of customers respond to an NPS score. So it's a great way to do it. I highly encourage you to do it. Some people, debate, the surveys, like, most people do, but where else can you ask your clients for 10 seconds at a time to give you feedback in such an easy way? Definitely do it.
Awesome. So our next question says, at what annual churn percentage should you stop and rethink the product fit? Any kind of benchmark ranges there, or when things?
Yeah, so I think
Chris.
It's going to be really important to understand where the annual churn rate is coming from. There's a couple components, and it actually the question is the success to actually have to use example SaaSoptics, where we see is actually good from our customers' perspective. Our biggest cause of churn is an acquisition, or our customers achieving a exit, which is phenomenal for them. But we're seeing our churn. It's really important.
Hey, Chris. Sorry to interrupt. You are breaking up a bit, and the audience is so you're breaking up every other word, so it's really hard to hear you. Is there a way for you to dial in using a phone? Hey, Chris. Well, why don't we text Chris separately? So let me try to answer that question. And the question again is, what happens if your churn rate is tough, and you basically should go back to the drawing board. This is definitely a it depends answer, and I know that's unsatisfactory. I've seen a lot of churn rates in my days. If you sell to micro businesses, right, small businesses that pay you monthly, I've seen churn over 50% on a monthly basis. And by the way, you could survive that if you're actually getting your customers, at a very, very low cost. So there's, in basically trying to understand if you have a good financial model, it really is a combination of your churn rate and then your customer acquisition cost. So you imagine if you can just get customers for free, right? Let's just imagine a world where your customers, you don't spend any money to get your customers. They come, they sign up for your product, they use it. You can actually withstand a whole lot of churn and still make money. But if you're spending a lot of money to get a customer, let's say you spend $1,000 to get a customer that's paying you $100 a month, that means it'll take you 10 months just to get to profitability in that customer. And if they're churning within the first 6 months, that's certainly unacceptable. You do not have a business there. But just in general, on the SMB side, I see churn rates, anywhere from 20% annually to 35%, 40% annually, and still be a healthy business. If you're an enterprise customer, an enterprise sale where you're spending a lot of money paying expensive sales reps, taking everyone out to dinner, doing lots of events, you probably need 90+% retention, and you probably need net negative revenue retention, which means that you're really selling more to each of your folks. So it does run the gamut. There's no easy answer, but certainly the more you spend to get a customer, the higher your retention rate needs to be.
Great. We have another question, and that is, what do you do if CS and finance come to the table and have different numbers? How would you go about kind of reconciling there?
Wow, different numbers. Hey, Chris, I don't know if you're still on.
Yeah, are you guys able to hear me now?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I apologize for the internet troubles. But yeah, as far as the different numbers question, I think it's really important that everybody's speaking from the same source of truth. So it might be really critical to get on the same page as far as where those numbers are coming from. From my experience, I would recommend, finance is really good at making sure everything ticks and ties, everything balances out. So where I've seen a good number come from is typically the finance team. But I'm going to caveat that and say what's really important, and what I was trying to talk about earlier, and you did a great job answering that question as far as what's a critical churn rate, is combining both sets of data. So understanding what's driving that churn. But the original source of the data, it needs to be the same data set so that the calculations are the same, because you can't be operating under incorrect data. So you certainly want to get together, have a meeting, and make sure that you reconcile that.
Yeah, and I'll add something to that, and for the CS folks, right? So if CS comes, with a let's just say one retention rate and argues for that, and finance comes in with another, I will say historically, because finance really keeps the books, a typical CEO or board will favor the finance team. So on the CS side, if you do believe the number's wrong, you will have a higher burden of proof than finance. And so be ready for that, get your ducks in a row, whatnot. Maybe offer to arm wrestle them or thumb wrestle them to win, any way you can, but you will have a higher burden of proof.
Great. I think that will wrap up our webinar for today, and I want to thank everyone for attending. And at the end of this webinar, a survey will pop up, so if you could go ahead and give your feedback there, we would really appreciate it. And thank you both to you, Mon and Chris.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.